Welcome to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kurt Woeller, talking with experts in functional and integrative health and medicine, discussing critical information for improving your health and wellness to help you live a long, full life. Let's get to it. Hi, this is Dr. Kurt Woeller, and in this episode, I interview Dr. Michael Joseph. Dr. Joseph is a doctor of drugless functional medicine. He has a PhD in orthomolecular and natural medicine. And our focus in this conversation is on two nutrients, vitamin C and niacin, or vitamin B3. And what's interesting with regards to this interview is going beyond just sort of the standard information you often hear about vitamins, like vitamin C, which is talked about a lot. But one of the things that sets Dr. Joseph apart is not only his in-depth knowledge in the clinical use of these nutrients, but the historical significance of these nutrients going back into the history of medicine. Now, in his practice, Dr. Joseph merges functional, orthomolecular, and natural medicine concepts to really help create a comprehensive and drugless approach that, in my experience, is rivaled by a few really in the healthcare world. And so his deficiency-based medicine methodology is really a new take on the tried and true orthomolecular medicine methods of the likes of Dr. Pauling, Hoffer, and Dr. Klenner. So I think you're going to find this interview very interesting and really kind of unique with regards to this particular topic on these nutrients. So here is my interview with Dr. Joseph. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Kurt. Thanks for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about. We're going to get into a lot of topics about vitamin C, about vitamin B3. But before we do that, just give us a quick overview of your education and training and how you got interested in these two important nutrients.
Well, I really appreciate being on, and it's an honor. And I can't talk about my education without talking about Integrative Medicine Academy. Just basically your functional medicine and toxicity and autism curriculums. That's a huge part of my education. So I want to thank you for that, because I wouldn't be here today without that. But I started this whole journey when I was about 24 years old, back in the early 2000s, where I was always interested in health and health-related topics, because I got started in martial arts when I was a kid, and then I started playing football and dealt with a lot of injuries, and I was always undersized compared to some of the other guys I played ball with. So I always had an interest in this sort of stuff. But when I was in my early 20s, I did not have a good health status. I wasn't overweight or anything. I was just constantly in bad shape. So, I was essentially bedridden at one point. And so I couldn't find anybody to help me. I didn't have the money for it. So I decided to show up at a school that taught integrative nutrition. And I didn't have the money to do it. So I didn't have anything else going on. So I essentially went up to the managing director and said, I got no place else to go. So I said that they would either enroll me or they would have to physically remove me, because I really had nothing else to do. So they offered me a work study program. And so I studied for a year and got my first certification in integrative nutrition as a holistic health counselor. And then I started practicing and working with a medical doctor who was on the board of police surgeons. And I started working with retired policemen, firefighters, some young people. Most of the people I worked with were over the age of 50, and a lot of them over the age of 65. So that's kind of like where I started working with the senior population. Things went well, and then I started in private practice, but I was always improving my education through independent study and reading. And about 10 years later, I started to enroll in your courses and follow your lectures after seeing you speak in Los Angeles on various different topics regarding healthcare legislation and autism. And, it was absolutely fascinating stuff. And I thought you were a great teacher. So I started following a lot of your courses, and the functional medicine course was really the biggest educational foundation that I had for my functional medicine doctorate. So I got my doctorate in natural medicine from a small kind of Christian-based natural medicine school. And then I followed up with a doctorate in functional medicine and a doctorate in molecular medicine. I finally finished my master's in clinical nutrition. So I finished those two doctorates during the pandemic era, and I constantly upgrading and updating my education, studying with a variety of different people over the years. So, because we're going on about 25 years now. So I built up my library at about 1,500 books on the subject, hundreds of papers, dozens of newsletters, and it's gotten to the point where when you're doing this long enough, you realize more and more how little you really do know, and how lifelong learning is really the most important aspect of this. Because like Socrates said back when he was teaching, the only true knowledge is the knowledge that you know nothing. So in every appointment that I have with a patient, regardless as to what the patient's situation is or what the subject matter is, I just go into the situation with a blank slate.
I was going to say, one of the things that, and what you just said about, I mean, it's kind of the same thing I feel. The more I learn, the more I study, the less I know, and how humbling it is. And I know you have an organization called Drugless Functional Medicine, which I definitely want to get into that approach, because I know that's something that you have dedicated a tremendous amount of your existence within this integrated functional medicine space, and bringing awareness to what drugless functional medicine is. I want to get into that a little bit later. Let's segue, if we can, and talk about vitamin C. And then I want to talk about vitamin B3. And, for the listener out there, it's important to understand what most people know of vitamin C is, you take it because, you get a cold, or, it's something you get in oranges. And even within the world of functional medicine, it often gets overlooked, and I think underappreciated, for the significance of what vitamin C is all about. And what I've always appreciated about you, Michael, is your perspective on these types of nutrients, your clinical experience in using these nutrients, the historical significance of these nutrients, and how things work throughout the body and from a biochemical standpoint. So to start things off, what is vitamin C, and why is it so important for human biochemistry and overall health?
Well, this is definitely a high mileage topic, and the extent of the subject matter of vitamin C, it's nearly endless, because every single day I'm finding out something new about this tiny, seemingly innocuous and insignificant molecule that people kind of take for granted. But I think it's important for us to kind of look at it from the perspective of the EU. Now, the EU has its own sort of health organization that's similar to like the FDA over here, or like the USDA. It's or like the CDC, but it seems to be a little bit more neutral. It's not to say that the EU is better than the United States. They just have a different approach when it comes to things like nutrients. So the EU made a declaration a short time ago about various different nutrients, and when they were talking about things like vitamin C and niacin and vitamin E and so forth, they used words and phrasing like normal functioning. Like, for instance, they stated that they have like 10 or 12 points about vitamin C, that vitamin C is necessary for normal functioning immunity, for a normally functioning nervous system, for normal functioning vascular function. And so they're not using words like support or may or can't. This is a definitive slam dunk irrefutable statement where they say where they're essentially saying without this nutrient, you will not have a normal functioning XYZ. So if we look at it from the perspective of functional medicine, then there are like 10 or 12 very, very well-defined functions by the EU that stated by the EU that vitamin C is essential for, that without the inclusion of vitamin C, these things just don't work. Like what we call the immune system, which I have a completely different viewpoint on the immune system now after digging deep into this and into probiotics and everything that I learned about mycotoxins and how they affect the human body. I have a totally different perspective now on what we think is immunity. But like we don't have immunity without vitamin C. It simply doesn't exist. We are completely vulnerable to environmental toxins because without vitamin C, we have no capability of detoxifying. Vitamin C is the key nutrient in detoxification, and it's involved in liver detoxification. So without vitamin C, the liver just simply cannot get stuff out of the system that's not supposed to be there. It's also critically important for a normal functioning nervous system. Like your nervous system simply doesn't work. You can't make neurotransmitters. You can't convert or assimilate amino acids. You can't convert them into neurotransmitters and neurohormones. You can't uptake any mineral. You can't synthesize any nutrients. And one of the most important reasons for this is because vitamin C controls and regulates the hydroxylase enzyme system. Every hydroxylase enzyme in the body is regulated by vitamin C in kind of like almost like it modulates it. And without the presence of vitamin C, they don't work. I know one of the things that we talk about a lot in your courses is dopamine beta hydroxylase. And this is where I sort of started to dig deep into this and realize that there's phenylalanine hydroxylase, there's tyrosine hydroxylase, there's 1-alpha hydroxylase. There's a hydroxylase enzyme in every single chemical pathway that is either the terminal enzyme so that something can be utilized and reach its final conversion point, like with vitamin D. And there's also the amino acids. Like you cannot get from phenylalanine to tyrosine without the hydroxylase system, which is controlled by vitamin C.
By the way, tryptophan too and serotonin. So
I haven't even gotten to that point yet. I haven't even gotten to that yet.
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, you cannot convert any of these things without vitamins. You can't convert pregnenolone to progesterone. It's so pervasive. So when we're talking about nutrient conversion, which is the single biggest biochemical roadblock that we have as human beings, is we're terrible nutrient converters because we don't make the most ubiquitous and the most versatile nutrient in all of nature. There's not a single.
By the way, Michael, real quick, I want to just, so people who are listening, just to kind of give them a little bit of context to the phenylalanine, tyrosine, dopamine. What you're describing is the pathways for catecholamine production, such as dopamine, and then downstream norepinephrine, epinephrine, adrenaline production, which is necessary for energy. And when you can't convert dopamine to norepinephrine, you can have a buildup of dopamine within the nervous system. And that's problematic because dopamine is a very reactive chemical, and it creates a number of different toxic byproducts that are then damaging to the nervous system. So we see that a lot in organic acid testing, where we know that Clostridia bacteria can inhibit the function of the enzyme. But there's a lot of people out there. I think one of the statistics I saw was approximately 1 in 25 individuals, it's probably higher, but in North America have some sort of problem in their dopamine beta hydroxylase converting system. So, and then getting to what you're talking about before, phenylalanine, tyrosine, there's so much other biochemistry that's linked to just that pathway, and then you're expanding on that. So it's hugely, I don't know if that's a word. Well, it's a major system for neurological function. So go ahead.
Yeah, and there's a deeper rabbit hole here that is part of what you're talking about with dopamine. And I've discovered that there's something that is completely flown under the radar in not just functional medicine, but all aspects of medicine. And that's the alternate pathway, the tyramine pathway, where this hydroxylase enzyme system is involved in converting phenylalanine to tyrosine, tyrosine to L-DOPA, L-DOPA to dopamine, and then we have beta hydroxylase that converts to epinephrine and norepinephrine. But this is something else that I discovered, and the way that I discovered it was completely bizarre. Because, I'm a little bit of a bizarre guy. Like, I never aged out on things like comic books and video games and sports and cartoons. Like, I was just watching a Garfield cartoon yesterday, like I was 12 years old. So I still love this stuff, but I was really into comic books and Marvel for a very long time. And if anybody has ever seen the third Spider-Man, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, and Eddie Brock was the character that was played by Topher Grace, and Eddie Brock got access to the Venom suit. And Venom is an alien being that acts as a symbiote that assimilates the host and amplifies its characteristics. And one of the unique qualities of Venom is that he makes Eddie Brock crave two types of food: chocolate and brains, because the Venom entity is extremely aggressive, and it puts a tremendous amount of strain on the resources of the physical host. And one of those resources is tyramine. And chocolate and human brains are very, very high in tyramine and phenylethylamine. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a byproduct of phenylalanine conversion. So what happens is that he's got this craving for tyramine, and then when I looked into this, I started studying it, and I saw that this is kind of like a parallel pathway to the dopamine conversion, where if you don't properly convert phenylalanine to tyrosine and tyrosine to L-DOPA and then L-DOPA again to dopamine, the alternate pathway is that you're going to convert most of the time you're going to convert phenylalanine to tyrosine. But if there isn't a sufficient resource of the hydroxylase enzyme that is necessary for that, you're going to convert tyrosine to tyramine. And then tyramine might convert to tyrosine. It's a minor pathway, but more often than not, it's going to convert to octopamine, which was originally discovered in the octopus salivary gland. So that's why it's called octopamine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, octopamine is the most active and devastating of those catecholamines that you're talking about. It is like a pseudo neurotransmitter that leads to massive amounts of anxiety and massive amounts of aggressiveness. So in the face of vitamin C deficiency that controls this enzyme pathway, what happens is that if there is not enough of this hydroxylase enzyme because of vitamin C insufficiency, the dopamine conversion is going to be shunted and tyramine is going to take over. And it may convert small amounts to dopamine, but it's mostly going to convert to this octopamine chemical that leads to huge amounts of anxiety, uncontrollable aggression. And that's what this character was based on. So it kind of led me down this path. And the remarkable part about this is that dopamine beta hydroxylase converts tyrosine to octopamine. So it actually has two separate functions. So if we are not converting properly because of having a dynamic flow of vitamin C in our system, this is what winds up happening, which is one of the reasons why vitamin C is used as one of the major anti-stress nutrients, because it corrects this broken pathway. And what I was saying to my patients yesterday is that if a pathway is missing a nutrient, it just shuts down and stops working, and an alternate pathway will open up like this one. So this was something that I discovered that nobody talks about in this field. Like, I never hear anybody referring to tyramine with regards to any sort of anxiety disorder or attention deficit disorder, any of these things. And tyramine is in a lot of foods that people eat. So if there's insufficient vitamin C, if there's a broken hydroxylase enzyme system because of not enough resources for it, and people are eating a lot of high tyramine foods like hard cheeses and chocolate sometimes, and fermented foods are huge in functional medicine, and that is one of the number one highest sources of tyramine. So we have to understand that before we get into all this other cool stuff, we have to look at the basics and the basic functionality of the single most important nutrient that we have to supplement with, maybe with the exception of vitamin B3, and that's vitamin C, because vitamin C is going to make this conversion system work. And this is where I've seen in my practice, since I started using vitamin C more extensively 15 years ago, where I've seen things where people with problems with stress, even with myself, issues with anxiety, sleep disorders, once we start supplementing properly with vitamin C, and getting the right physiological dosage and trying to mimic mammalian production of it, we're seeing a lot of changes that we were told were not possible. And that's why understanding that vitamin C is more than just, take it when you get cold, or, it's good to keep you healthy in the wintertime. Like, vitamin C is critically important for our hormone and neurotransmitter and nutrient and biomolecule conversion systems to work properly. Because without it, we have a maladaptative response where we start making these pseudo neurotransmitters that make us function improperly, and then eventually cause a tremendous amount of damage because of the breakdown aspect of some of these fight or flight type of chemicals. So we can't deny the importance of vitamin C to just function normally, because without it, we don't function right.
So let me ask you, it's very interesting about the octopamine, I guess, because I know that tyramine is one of those things that's often linked to migraine headaches, for example. And the octopamine, so do you know how that compound is metabolized?
It's broken down into another compound that is another sort of pseudo neurotransmitter. It begins with an S. I can't remember what it is offhand because I'm not in front of the computer. This is a really complicated type of biochemistry because it's like it's linked to so many different things. But the tyramine and migraine headache thing kind of lines up because the brain is a storage area for tyramine, which is why that character Venom liked eating human brains, because it was so high in tyramine and phenylethylamine. So elevated levels of tyramine in the brain could cause somebody to have some migraine headaches, and then the vitamin C would certainly play a role in that. But what happens, I think, after octopamine converts to that other substance, I think that's just kind of the end of the line, where that other chemical it just degrades, kind of like epinephrine and norepinephrine, where they degrade too. So it's sort of like a mirror image of epi and norepi, where it doesn't necessarily do the same things, but it's kind of involved in that pathway. I still haven't looked as deeply into that as I need, because this is still pretty recent to me. It's like over the past year and a half I've been looking into this. So, but this is something where by understanding the importance of the functionality of the primary pathway, and making sure that we have smooth conversion from the amino acids to dopamine and then dopamine to epi and norepi. And then again, this all started with your functional medicine course in 2019. I think
I was going to say, Michael, one of the things I wanted to mention was what always impresses me about having a conversation with you is not only your depth of knowledge and looking at things from a wide variety of perspectives, but we come back to the fundamentals. When I was in osteopathic medical school, I tutored anatomy, and I did a lot of anatomy dissections, and I also helped a lot in neuroanatomy, and I was very, very good at it. And you come away from that and you go, well, I mean, of course, pretty much everything's been discovered from an anatomical standpoint. What's left? And then you realize that's not the case at all. They discover things new. I don't want to say all the time, but there's new discoveries because of new technology and imaging studies, et cetera. And it's the same thing in human physiology, biochemistry, and how our body functions. And so this alternate pathway you're talking about, to me, it's like, wow, that's really interesting. And now I know that I need to go look into this more. But fundamentally, when you start breaking it down, it gets back to the functionality, or the existence, I should say, of these fundamental nutrients, which is what's always impressed me about you, is how dedicated you are to the fundamental approach in just understanding how these things work, the importance of them, and the application of them. And so I'm curious, can you give a little bit of the medical history behind vitamin C and its use? Again, wow. Beyond just somebody running out to the local health food store and getting a packet of vitamin C powder because they're sick.
Right.
I mean, there are some significant figures in the world of medicine who, as time has gone on and medicine has sort of morphed into something else, or, pharmaceutical therapy, whatever, there are still those historical figures who knew the importance of this nutrient and used it in tremendously therapeutic ways.
Well, I think that's a great question. We got to go back a very, very long time and look at this from the standpoint of deficiency. I think when we start looking at human chemistry from a deficiency-based perspective, we start to understand more and more what we need to do in order to solve problems with our patients. So for me, that's just what I do, is that people come to me with all these different types of problems that they have, that they've been diagnosed with or not diagnosed with, or they're just not feeling right, or whatever the issue is. And my job is just to solve the problem. So the way that you solve a problem in mathematics is you look for the variable. You look for what's missing. Like 4x equals 2 or 2x equals 4. We have to define what x is. So in order to identify in order to identify the solution, we have to find what's missing. So I look at things from finding the deficiency first and fixing that. And medicine throughout the past 5,000 years, if we go back to the dawn of human civilization, which is the beginning of the Sumerian calendar in, I think it was 3560 BC. So we're not even, we are still, the type of era that we are now has been dwarfed by prehistory, or by the pre-Columbian history, or before the Gregorian calendar. There has been a problem that humanity faced for approximately 5,500 years, something called deficiency disease. And the two diseases that pop out as the most significant killers of mankind that have wreaked havoc on human civilization were scurvy and pellagra. I'm going to talk about pellagra in a couple of minutes. But scurvy, we found, was vitamin C deficiency. And it seems now in 2025 that, scurvy, doesn't exist because we found it's vitamin C, got a little bit of vitamin C, scurvy is gone. So we kind of take that for granted. But up until 1937, scurvy was such a massive problem. And it was for thousands of years, where no one knew what to do about it. In the 18th century, there was a British naval physician. His name was Dr. James Lind. He had an idea that scurvy itself was because of something that was missing from the diet of the sailors. So he did what now is known as the first clinical controlled trial in history, where he had several sailors taking one type of a diet and then another type of a diet, and then he was supplementing another group with lemon and lime. So as it turns out, the control groups all came down with symptoms of scurvy, whereas the group that was consuming the citrus had no symptoms of scurvy, no matter how long it was. So Lind surmised that there was some sort of factor in the lemon and lime that would prevent scurvy. And scurvy was the biggest inhibitor of long distance travel. Like when the age of exploration, because I'm a huge fan of the age of exploration. Like I played video games about this type of stuff till I was blue in the face. And, Sid Meier games on pirates and things like that. I grew up with this type of stuff. So I was always fascinated with archaeology, always fascinated with history. And I think that if we're involved in medicine in any capacity, whether it's naturopathy or some type of drugless medicine or conventional medicine, we have to study the history. We got to go all the way back as far as we can and study the way that medicine was done in times before there was electricity or even times before there was the wheel. But one thing that just popped out at me was how did the British Empire reach a point where the sun never set on it? It's because they had sailors and a naval or navy, to use the right word. They had a navy that was not dying halfway through their voyages, so they could travel great distances while everyone else was coming down with scurvy and making fun of the British Navy by calling them limeys. That's how we got the derogatory or the affectionate term for the British, limeys. It came from the consumption of these citrus fruits on these long voyages. Well, what happened was they would show up healthy and the British Empire exploded to the point where it was the most significant and the largest empire the human race has ever seen. Of course, that we know all the different sorts of aspects of it, with India and Africa, and we also remember about the American colonies and the American Revolution and so forth. But what was so significant about this is that they fixed a problem that was a major hindrance to the advancement of their civilization. And eventually everybody else kind of caught on it. But the nutrient itself wasn't actually isolated until 1937, when Albert Szent-Györgyi, a Hungarian scientist, isolated something called hexuronic acid from pimentos. And eventually this chemical was identified as vitamin C, and the name was changed to ascorbic acid, which means the anti-scorbutic factor. In fact, it is the only nutrient that is named for the deficiency that it cures and prevents. So this was something that dramatically changed medicine in the 1930s, because we also had the discovery of thiamine by Casimir Funk, who found out the nutrient that was missing that caused beriberi. And during this time period, there were discoveries for nicotinic acid, discoveries for vitamin E. And vitamin E was actually the first antioxidant supplement. It was actually discovered and isolated before vitamin C, but it didn't come into prominence until much later, where two Canadian doctors named the Shute brothers were using vitamin E for heart disease and literally, quote unquote, curing thousands of people with heart disease using just alpha tocopherol. But vitamin C was discovered by Albert Szent-Györgyi in 1937, and it was renamed the anti-scorbutic factor because of its effect on scurvy, and it eradicated scurvy. And just a note about Albert Szent-Györgyi is that he was almost like a celebrity scientist in Eastern Europe, and he was Jewish, and apparently he was so popular and so well liked by the Hungarians and by the Jewish community and by Eastern Europe that he was number one on Adolf Hitler's hit list, that Hitler was obsessed with Albert Szent-Györgyi from what I read. So that was one thing apparently that Hitler was extremely frustrated about, that he never got to assassinate Albert Szent-Györgyi. But Szent-Györgyi really changed what we call medicine. And then eventually there were other figures like Erwin Stone, who did extensive research on vitamin C and actually got Linus Pauling into it. There was Frederick Klenner in the 1940s who cured, and I use the word cure very, very loosely because once people get to know me, they realize that I'm not really big into using the word cure because I'm not really big into the word disease either. I think after studying all this deficiency stuff and studying all this stuff with vitamin C and niacin and the absence of a thing, really led me to understand more about how people get sick and why. So I'm using the word cure very, very, very loosely here, but he cured 60 out of 60 polio patients that were diagnosed by somebody else within 3 days using infusions of vitamin C in 1945. And
and Michael, I just read about that. In fact, I'm currently reading a book, Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Humphreys on that. I was actually reading that specifically, and it's interesting because, and this could be a whole other discussion on polio, but clearly the use of arsenic compounds, lead compounds, DDT, other pesticides, and if you think about the link that can have to neurological problems and neurological damage, and the influence of vitamin C, not only from a detoxification standpoint, but from an antioxidant standpoint, a biochemistry upregulation standpoint, you can see where some of these people were greatly helped with just the infusion of this particular nutrient. And I know Linus Pauling is a figure within the world of chemistry and Nobel Prize winner, and but he instantly became a quack when he started advocating for large doses of vitamin C, and there's a whole story behind that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, it predates that because it was Albert Sabin in the late 1930s who did an absolutely horrible, slanted, completely rigged experiment trying to prove that vitamin C did nothing for polio. And if you look at the experiment that he did, it was obvious that he set the experiment up to fail. And because Albert Sabin, he had his sights set on a polio vaccine that he was in the 1940s and 50s actually, he was having tested in the Soviet Union. So that's a whole other discussion that's gonna, that's a powder keg. But we'll certainly move on. But it's important to understand that every single so-called viral disease that vitamin C was tested against, vitamin C neutralized the so-called virus. So that changes the entire perspective on what we call viruses. And the significant part of the Klenner trial was that he cured these people of polio where they got up and walked out in 3 days. There were 2 patients where it took 4 days. And there were only 2 relapses 5 years later, I think, or 3 years later. And once they started taking vitamin C again, they were back to normal. And this particular protocol was done countless times since 1945. And don't forget, it was 1955 that the Salk vaccine for polio came out. And then there was the Cutter incident where there were actually people getting polio from the polio vaccine. And yet 10 years prior to that, we had somebody that was curing this stuff in a weekend. And yet it just went nowhere because, like they say, there's no profit in a cure. And I think that this was completely money driven. And once you get through with Dissolving Illusions, there's another book called The Virus and the Vaccine that was actually a source for Suzanne Humphreys in that book. Because I read that book about 5 or 6 years ago, and then I read her kind of biography after that. And it's the work that she did on that book is absolutely startling, and it dwarfs like everything since the book The Poison Needle, if we're talking about vaccines, if we're talking about real cures for things. So, but we'll move on.
That follow-up book is the next on my to read list. I actually have it.
It's wild. That book is wild, man. Like we're certainly going to have a conversation about that because she takes the gloves off in that book and she spills the beans and gets real personal. And it's like you get really connected to her in that, which is great. It's really great to see people that just say, I'm just going to go and tell everybody about my life story and about what I experienced and who I am. And just not hide anything. And that's remarkable, because these days people are always hiding something, and she just comes right out and just, it's like, hey, this is what happened with me in my life, and deal with it. So you got to respect her for that. But it's a wild ride, that book, let me tell you.
So I want to, make sure we transition over to vitamin B3, but I have a few more questions on the vitamin C. Okay. So first off, and I have to ask it because it comes up a lot in functional integrated medicine today. Any concern, some concern, great concern with regards to vitamin C and oxalate?
Okay. I'm glad that you asked this question, because this has been a thorn in my side for years. And one thing that I have to bring up over here is that there was a tremendous amount of fear mongering with regards to vitamin C and oxalic acid. And oxalate poisoning is definitely a real thing. And we've both experienced it. We've seen what it is. But as far as what causes it, there's been a tremendous amount of not misinformation, but misinterpreted or misunderstood information. And I remember we talked about the biochemistry of vitamin C metabolism, and that it just degrades and converts into oxalic acid. I've actually not found any real corroborated proof on that vitamin C in any situation converts to oxalate or oxalic acid. And if you think about it, like the common house cat, which is supposedly a slow converter or a low converter of vitamin C, the common house cat weighs somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds on the high end. Like my cat's about 10 pounds, 4 pounds of that is fur. So she's a little bit of a thing, except for this gigantic fur coat that she has in the middle of a Florida summer, which you can tell is not good for her. She doesn't particularly like that, but cats make about 1.5 grams of vitamin C per day. So let's just extrapolate that. Say the cat's 10 pounds to like a 100-pound human being. Okay, that's 1.5 grams is 15 grams for a human being. I mean, that's ridiculous. So, or something even more than that. It's some ridiculous amount. Like my math is probably off today, but we're looking at like if oxalate in that, if vitamin C in that amount converted to oxalic acid in the ways that we were told, then we wouldn't have any life on the surface of this planet, because everything would be dying of oxalate poisoning. It just doesn't line up with actual biology. So that was the first thing that was my sign. I was like, well, why isn't my cat dead right now? And why is it that like rabbits can live 9 to 12 years and they're high converters of vitamin C? What about how rats don't get atherosclerosis? They don't get sick. Rats don't actually get sick. And why is it that even though the chimpanzee is closest to us genetically, biochemically, we have more in common with the guinea pig, which is why guinea pigs are common lab experiment animals. So why is it? Because guinea pigs don't make vitamin C, and neither do human beings. So they're susceptible to all the same diseases as human beings. I had a guinea pig as a kid who died of pneumonia. And pneumonia is one of the leading causes of death in guinea pigs. And also pneumonia is one of the leading causes of death in human beings. One of the reasons why is we don't make vitamin C. And then we'll talk about the vitamin B3 factor in a minute. So that was the first kind of red flag for me. But in my thesis for functional medicine, I included in it a section on vitamin C and oxalate, conjecture versus clinical evidence. And it's important for us to recognize, too, that as I was researching this stuff over the past couple of years, especially during the COVID pandemic time period, I stumbled upon a number of different clinical reports now this is definitely a heated conversation, which I'd love to go and tackle another day, but I found maybe 5 or 6 published reports of parents bringing their young autistic child to a doctor who was diagnosing them with scurvy because they were so terrified of the effect of oxalate on their kids that they completely cut vitamin C out of their diet and did no supplementation with it. And I mean, it was like 5 reports that I found, and then I stopped because I just couldn't take it. It was just enough. So there was a major, that's a 100-year regression where we were seeing that because of people who were told something that was not necessarily accurate, that they wound up making the situation worse. So I compiled a lot of data, and I even did my own experimentation. So when it comes to oxalic acid, we need to understand that there is no relationship between vitamin C and the formation of kidney stones. In fact, there was a study that was done, a large-scale Harvard prospective health professional follow-up study, that the groups that took higher levels of vitamin C, greater than 1,500 milligrams a day, had a lower risk of kidney stones. So the whole kidney stone thing is something that was debunked so many times in these different studies. Like Chereskin, Ringsdorf, and Sisley explained that vitamin C connection in 1983. So this is over 40 years ago, that acidic urine or slightly acidic urine reduces the union of calcium and oxalate, reducing the possibility of stones. And then Robert Cathcart also said that despite the lack of clinical evidence of kidney stones in people taking vitamin C, that there was a practice of people saying that vitamin C causes kidney stones. Now, one thing that I discovered, and this was also in the functional medicine course, anybody listening, if you take that course, you're going to see what I'm talking about. You brought up the actual chemical bond of the various different types of minerals with oxalic acid. And the most common form of oxalate is calcium oxalate. This is where we get oxalate crystals. That's 80 to 85 to 90% of the presence of oxalate in the human body. And this is the weakest bond of all of the different minerals that you mentioned. Well, as it turns out, vitamin C has a significantly stronger affinity for calcium. That's how we have calcium ascorbate. That's how we're able to go and get calcium into bone, because vitamin C forces it into bone. But here's the thing about this, is that why is it that sometimes when people take vitamin C, they see elevations of oxalic acid on their organic acid reports? My assertion, based on what I've done working with patients doing astronomical amounts of vitamin C, where we saw the oxalic acid go up and then drop as we continue to do higher amounts of vitamin C. And we don't have time to go over it now, but anybody that's interested in this report, I'll certainly be happy to share it with them, because it's like a dozen pages. And I put it together as part of my thesis. And it's something that I've seen happen time and time again, is that there is a very, very distinct plausibility that vitamin C disassociates calcium from oxalic acid and allows the oxalic acid to be excreted through the urine through the kidney filtration system.
It's very interesting. And I mean, I've seen plenty of organic acid tests where somebody was taking high dose vitamin C and the oxalate levels are normal. So I mean, it's
So the problem is not oxalic acid. Okay, because oxalic acid by itself is meaningless. Like, it doesn't do anything. It's when oxalic acid combines with calcium that forms these disruptive inorganic crystals that cause damage to tissue. That's where we have a problem. So the problem isn't oxalic acid. The problem is calcium. And then another time we can talk about how the single most toxic substance in your body right now is dissociated calcium. And one thing that Americans do more than any other country per capita is we consume more calcium than anyone. We are the highest consuming calcium society the world has ever seen. So if we want to talk about what's happening to human health in America, we have to look at what's causing the biggest problem. As much as I hate glyphosate and 2,4-D and all the environmental toxins and mycotoxins, it's the stuff in our body right now that is poisoning us, and the stuff that we're told to eat in massive amounts like calcium. It's a big problem. So it's calcium oxalate that's the problem. And vitamin C disassociates calcium from oxalate and allows the body to utilize calcium effectively by forcing it into bone. Yeah. So just those two factors right there are really enough for me to say, we should really dial back this vitamin C causes oxalate issue and make sure that we've got people taking physiological doses of vitamin C and doing it consistently, so that there's this constant dynamic flow of vitamin C so that all these things work chemically and work flawlessly.
Here's the way I look at this too, Michael. So a couple of things. Dr. Thomas Levy has a couple of great books, one on calcium, one on vitamin C, which are very, very interesting. I have those in my library. The other thing is I know you have a website, drugless functional medicine, so druglessfunctionalmedicine.com. You have a lot of information on there. I know people can reach out to you through that website, to expand on this particular conversation. You actually have a section on vitamin C. You actually have a section on niacin, which is going to be our next category. And, I think the whole thing is sometimes we get too narrow in our view and make the recommendations for don't take any more, don't take more than 250 milligrams of vitamin C per day because it could, form oxalate, this kind of stuff. And the reality is that just like diet, just like dietary intervention, very much gets down to the bio-individual aspect of, what works in one person's body may not necessarily always work to the same degree in somebody else. And so to make these blanket statements about vitamin C causes oxalate and that's therefore a problem, to your point, somebody taking it to a really unfortunate level where it actually induced scurvy in their child unknowingly, and certainly not with intent, but out of fear, that is not servicing, really anyone in the health world, medicine, functional medicine world. So obviously there's much more that we could discuss about this, and I'd like to have you back and expand on that conversation. But before we move on to vitamin B3, in general, okay, describe just briefly your use of different forms of vitamin C, because you actually came up with a protocol or an outline in sort of the way that you viewed vitamin C and how to maybe to optimize levels. And again, we're not getting into, individual aspects of a particular person, but sort of in general, for somebody who's listening to this, say, hey, I want to actually do more of this. I want to maybe, take some more vitamin C just to kind of optimize potential. What would be sort of a general recommendation that you've seen helpful for others?
Well, a lot of what I've done, I based on the concepts of Stephen Hickey and Tom Levy and, of course, Linus Pauling. And Linus Pauling was very into large single dosages. I think I met an old lady who I think was 90 at the time, and she was the owner of a supplement company for something like 50 or 60 years, 70 years, something like that. And she knew Linus Pauling personally, and she went out to dinner with him one time and saw him take spoonfuls of this white powder and put it in his tall glass of water. And as it turns out, right there at dinner, he took something like 45 grams of vitamin C just right there and just drank the whole thing. And as it turns out, Linus Pauling had stomach cancer for 30 years. And he died in his 90s with stomach. And they say, well, the vitamin C stuff doesn't work because he had stomach cancer. Well, he lived for 30 years with stomach cancer. So, I mean, that's something that is that needs to be understood, that he would have died 30 years prior to that. So anyway, but so he was really big into the single dosages, and I don't have a problem with that. If some people want to go ahead and do that, you just have to understand your tolerance level to that. But Dr. Richard Cheng, who was one of the doctors in Wuhan that was doing vitamin C for the COVID thing, and I sat in on his seminar, and he starts people, every single patient that comes into his office, he's, according to this seminar, he starts them on 6 grams of vitamin C spread out throughout the course of the day. So what I do with people is I get them immediately started on 2 grams of vitamin C, which would be 1,000 milligrams in the morning and 500 at lunch and 500 at dinner. It's easy to do. It's duplicatable. It's very difficult to forget. And usually we would use some type of an ascorbate, something really inexpensive like magnesium ascorbate For some people, calcium ascorbate, the ester C is really good. There are mixed ascorbates that like calcium, potassium, and magnesium ascorbate. There's even a zinc ascorbate, which I think is absolutely phenomenal, which I'm going to start carrying next week. There's also the fat-soluble form ascorbyl palmitate, which has been used since the 1950s as a preservative in food. Like we wouldn't be able to get parquet or any of these artificial butters without ascorbyl palmitate, because ascorbyl palmitate and vitamin E were used as the preservatives to stop them from going rancid. So ascorbyl palmitate is still actually kind of recent, but it is an absolutely incredible, powerful form of vitamin C that actually gets into fatty tissue. And I've used it with women with breast cancer because breast cancer is a condition of fatty tissue that may or may not be cancer, maybe actually something else that might have been misdiagnosed. So again, that's another story for another time because I've got some words on that as well. So I would use typically a mixed ascorbate or magnesium ascorbate or calcium ascorbate and start someone off at about 2,000 milligrams. If they were just somebody that just wanted, hey, how do I just get started with this? But typically, if I'm working with somebody full-time on a weekly basis and for an extended period of time, we tend to start very, very high with vitamin C and see where their level of bowel tolerance is. We'll do a liposomal, we'll do multiple forms, and then we'll see how, if we're doing it at that amount and they have bowel tolerance, loose stools, we'll reduce it. And if it turns out they don't, then we'll keep increasing it until we reach that threshold. So vitamin C is a very unique nutrient where we start as high as we possibly can, and then we lower it to the level that would work most effectively at that person most consistently. Now, as we segue into niacin, nicotinic acid, vitamin B3, if we're talking about nicotinic acid, the flush form of niacin, we usually start with a very small amount, like 50 to 100 milligrams, and then we try to increase it to see what sort of level we can reach where we still can induce a flush. So the two nutrients go hand in hand with one another. Very important the way they interact with one another, but the way that they're approached is very, very different. And it's something that nobody else in this industry that I've spoken to takes that type of approach where they do it completely different with different nutrients. They'll just give somebody a multivitamin, give them some supplements and say, kiss it up to God. Whereas what I do is much more targeted, much more specific, and we're looking for predictable outcomes, not necessarily just let's see what happens. Like I know when I give somebody 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C, I know what to expect. Right. And the same thing with niacin. I can predict the exact time that they're going to get the flush. So a lot of times when I work with people with niacin, especially nicotinic acid, I'll have them, okay, you got to text me or call me, check in with me every day that you're doing this. I want a record of it because I match it up to whatever the predicted outcome was from when we started.
Well, one thing I think it's interesting is the multi-dosing throughout the day. And it's important for people to understand, too, is that our need for these nutrients changes based on demand of our body in context of what we're being exposed to, the different stressors, whether it's an infectious stress, a traumatic stress, or just mental emotional stress, or just the physical aspect of living life. So there's a constant need for these nutrients to assist in our biochemistry. And I find it very interesting with regards to just the different forms that tend to get utilized based on absorption and functionality. So let's move on. I want to move on now to niacin, so B3, because there's a lot to discuss here. And then we'll kind of tie these together. So fundamentally,
one thing that I want to say to conclude what you were just saying on vitamin C, so we can start talking about vitamin B3. It's really important to understand that different nutrients have different times of degradation or times in which they are used up by the body. They got different half-lives. Like, for instance, I remember in the functional medicine course, you talked about vitamin D, as in David, vitamin D3, having a half-life of approximately 27 days. So you would have to go basically 2 full months without vitamin D before you started seeing symptoms of deficiency. Well, to contrast that, According to the Reardon Clinic and the information that I got from them and cross-referencing with other sources, I've estimated that vitamin C, when you take it orally or do it intravenously, it has a half-life of no more than 54 minutes. So within 4 hours of doing an intravenous vitamin C or taking oral vitamin C, you can't detect that level anymore in the blood. So vitamin C goes in and out super quickly. And niacin is probably even faster than that. So, and we look at something like thiamine. Thiamine's half-life is like 36 hours. So you look at the different nutrients and the way that most people recommend them as practitioners in this line of work, there's no specification. They say, just do a lot of vitamin D, or here, take some vitamin C, or take a multivitamin. And yet, like in my vitamin D course, I provide considerable evidence that the need for vitamin C and magnesium supersedes the need for supplementary vitamin D3 if we want to go and get active vitamin D working properly. So it's really important for people listening to understand that there's no cookie cutter approach to each one of these nutrients, which is why the therapy that I do tends to involve single nutrients where doing like what you said, the bio-individuality of the person, where targeting specific deficiencies that are unique to that person, in addition to the global or systemic deficiencies like vitamin C and niacin that everybody has to deal with. So I just want to make that very clear that there's a different approach depending on the nutrient itself.
So let's talk about niacin. So
yep.
Give some examples of niacin in human physiology and what can happen when it's deficient.
Well, like I said before, there were two deficiency diseases that were ravaging humankind for thousands of years. Scurvy was one of them, but the more insidious and devastating one was something called pellagra. And pellagra was identified by the 4 Ds, which was dermatitis, skin boils, dementia, where it's exactly like the type of dementia that we see here today. It's called Alzheimer's disease or mental illness, but the definition of dementia originated with pellagra and pellagra cases. And diarrhea, digestive issues. Diarrhea is actually the #1 cause of death in the world right now. And then the final D of pellagra was death. So there were these 4 stages, the 4 biochemical horsemen of the apocalypse, if you will: famine, pestilence, death, and war. So you had dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. Throughout the course of history, there is no single disease, no single cause of death that has ravaged humankind more than pellagra. We've seen it in ancient history. We've seen it in ancient Sumeria. It's referenced in the conquest of the Roman Empire by Hannibal, that it was a major problem and probably one of the reasons why he didn't sack Rome is because his troops were starving to death. And just as another note, like one of the major reasons why Rome wanted Carthage is because Carthage had figured out how to farm in such a way where they ended these types of diseases. So the major reason why they sacked Carthage was they wanted this information on farming. It's a fascinating historical tidbit that when you see it, because they destroyed everything except this documentation on how to farm, and that's where the Roman Empire really exploded in the Mediterranean, was once they learned how to make farming and agriculture a pillar of their society. So the aspect of pellagra, which was tied to vitamin B3 deficiency, niacin deficiency in the early to mid 20th century, pellagra was just devastating. It was the sort of thing that was such a huge issue that more soldiers died in the Civil War from pellagra than they did from gunshot wounds. And this is the case in almost every war in human history. You look at when Napoleon invaded Russia during the Russian winter, it wasn't the winter that killed Napoleon's campaign. It wasn't actual skirmishes or conflict. It was the fact that the further into Russia that Napoleon went, the more that the Russians were destroying the farmlands. They couldn't forage. They couldn't get any food. And Napoleon's soldiers were dropping dead from pellagra. They were getting pellagra within 6 weeks. The same thing happened to the Germans when they made the same mistake and invaded Russia during the Russian winter. So that was probably the turning point in both wars, separated by about 100 or 130 years from one another. So it's important to recognize that when we look at military history, when we look at the history of civilization, the number one problem that leaders were trying to solve was pellagra. Most medicine for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is based on dealing with pellagra. I've even got in my little introduction to niacin lecture, I've made comparisons between pellagra and leprosy, that it's entirely possible that lepers they didn't have an infectious disease because of some type of bacteria. They had a unique form of pellagra that affected them more so than anybody else, because we've got countless stories of people going to these colonies and helping lepers and not catching leprosy. There's even Baldwin IV, who was the leper king of Jerusalem, who had leprosy, but none of his caretakers, none of his relatives, none of the people who had contact with him caught it. And he was one of the great military leaders of the Crusades, and he died at like 23 years old. But he had full-blown leprosy, but nobody ever caught it.
So one of the things I read the other day is that what you mentioned about the Civil War, I mean, the vast majority of people died, from diarrhea. It was actually diarrhea was a big part of it now. So I didn't make the connection to niacin, but, you think about from a biochemical standpoint, and I can't remember now if it's 400, 600, or 800. I know it's a lot of enzymes in our body are dependent on vitamin B3, typically as nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So it makes sense if you start breaking it down between dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and then eventually death. If you just sort of chase down the enzymatic reactions of metabolism that are dependent on vitamin B3, you can see how it could affect so many different systems in the body, and how just a deficiency state could just wreak havoc. Absolutely.
Yeah. And human beings are capable of converting niacin from tryptophan. But again, you planted the seed, because I got more into this after taking the functional medicine course, where you talked about how, we were discussing quinolinic acid, about how niacin shunts the conversion of tryptophan to quinolinic acid, and that also how niacin requires 50 to 60 milligrams of tryptophan to make 1 milligram of niacin. So it's a horribly, horribly inefficient conversion process, even though there are some people that maybe are genetically predisposed to making a little bit more, which is why if you look at the Great Plague of the Black Plague of Europe during the Crusades, there are cases of people living in the same house, like maybe 5 people, where 3 of them would get pellagra, but 2 of them wouldn't, where people would carry these dead bodies out. That's where we have the whole concept of, bring out your dead and ringing the bell and the Grim Reaper. It all comes from the Black Plague, which was concurrent to the Crusades. And one of the biggest issues that Europe was facing was that all of the resources were going towards these various crusades. And over time, there was significant famine, which eventually leads to pestilence. And if we follow the biblical 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, pestilence is always preceded by famine. So it's famine, pestilence, death, and war. Again, the 4 horsemen of nutritional deficiency: dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. So there's a very, very strong connection there. But one thing that I've noticed is that if you look at pestilence, and if you look at plague, going back to the plague of Justinian, several thousand years, they are symptomologically no different than epidemic or pandemic level pellagra. It's almost identical. Like the whole idea of the bubonic plague, the boils, where we get the term boo-boos from, that's identical to the dementia that we see in literal pellagra cases, peregrines. And if you look at the extreme pelagrins where you see like the actual fingers and hands and extremities like literally falling off, there's no visual difference between that and leprosy. So if we go and we look at these sorts of things, pellagra is a big deal. And it was a big deal, such a big deal. In the early 20th century, it was the fourth leading cause of death in the United States, and it was the leading cause of death in the South. So it killed something like 400,000 people over a period of time. And 100 years ago, that's a lot of people. That is more than most diseases that we have today that kill a ton of people. So that is a lot. That was a significant portion of the population. And it was Casimir Funk, the Polish scientist who discovered thiamine, who said that there was something about the milling of corn that was causing all of these people to come down with these cases of pellagra, because there was something they were removing that prevented it. Because he was the guy who coined the term vitamin by using the term vital amine, and it was shortened to vitamin. So he was a big proponent of what we call vitamin theory. And if it wasn't for him and some of the other scientists from that time period, we wouldn't have a supplement industry. We wouldn't be talking about this. We'd still probably be ravaged by beriberi, pellagra, and scurvy. But the significance of pellagra was recognized to the point where it was like a national problem.
So why do you think why is it a problem now? I mean, so you figure, or is it just not recognized? You think that general medicine just overlooks these things and assumes that people are not deficient because foods are fortified with these, you know, something like B3? Is that what's happening? But are we looking at, I don't necessarily like the word subclinical, but maybe that's the best description now, is that there's just a lot of people out there who are nutrient deprived, maybe as opposed to nutrient deficient in the classical sense, but it's just not recognized because there's a tremendous assumption that we don't have vitamin deficiencies anymore because foods get fortified.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Part of it is the public taking this stuff for granted. The other part of it is a large portion of the medical industry is dependent on those Ds. Like, think about the amount of money that is made from skincare products. And then we also talk about dementia. Look at, if we expand dementia into general mental illness, and you look at the psychotropic drug industry, you look at the psychiatry industry, how many of these cases of mental illness that we have in the United States of America could be completely eradicated with proper vitamin B3 supplementation. And I've seen it happen, and I'm a perfect example of that. And someday we'll share more about my journey with vitamin B3, because as much as the biochemistry is super fascinating, about vitamin B3 is an experiential nutrient where it's like you have to experience it. And once you experience it, you don't care what the biochemistry is. I get really into the biochemistry of vitamin C because it's fascinating. Okay, so is niacin, but there's no single nutrient that I've ever taken, that I've ever given somebody, that made that immediate of an impact where I don't have to sell somebody on the chemistry, where I don't have to sell somebody on what it's done or even talk about the history. All I got to do is give them the niacin and wait. And then I get a phone call. Oh my God, I've never felt this good in my life.
So give an example. Give a clinical example of that.
A perfect example is like I use niacinamide a lot. Okay, but a perfect example is like a breast cancer patient that I've had where there were some psychological concerns that we had. And there was a lot of coaching there that we were doing, a lot of like, personal development. And I got her started on a very, very intensive niacinamide plus also niacin protocol where she was taking gram levels of niacin. And she said that once she started taking the niacin, she was able to grasp psychologically and mentally the restorative life coaching that we were doing. Basically, it was just like personal development, where we started to see like a transition from somebody who was one way to a way that was much more functional, to the point where there wouldn't be any question of diagnosis. So that was, and this was somebody in their late 60s, where we did decades worth of repair in a very short period of time. Also with myself, we can have a discussion, just my personal experiences with niacin, and the effect that it had on me neurologically and also physically, stress-wise, you name it. But there's also countless patients that I've worked with where we used niacin in a sustained or a timed release where it would not necessitate the need for cholesterol medication anymore, which is the most obvious metric that we use with regards to niacin. So there are also general cases too, just me making a recommendation. Take 300 milligrams of niacin today. And then they get back to me and they say, you know something, I've got energy for the first time in my life. So niacin is just incredibly important, but more important than the chemistry is the experience of it. Is that the first time that you experience that flush, and then what happens after that is really a big deal. And for me, it's like that is the one nutrient that I cannot, under any circumstances, live without. I can't concentrate without it. And I made sure that I took 1,000 milligrams of it before we even had this call. So I'm living it as we're talking, because I took a large amount of B complex. I took 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, had a half a bottle of body armor for hydration, and electrolytes. And I also took 1,000 milligrams of timed release niacin. So it's the sort of thing where you have to experience it. And Dr. Abram Hoffer, who was the biggest proponent and researcher and scientist and clinical practitioner using niacin, he said that in order for a doctor or a practitioner to firmly understand how to use niacin with his or her patients, he had to use niacin first. So it was really like a physician heal thyself, because you needed to understand the effect of it in order for you to understand how it affects other people. So that's why I've come up with this sort of niacin protocol that is something that a lot of people don't do. And I never make a recommendation to somebody that I don't do with myself or that I don't give to my mother first. So, and she's taking about 1,000 milligrams of niacin now, which helped her tremendously from recovering from a stroke, which is more than she's ever taken. So I talk about niacin a lot more from an experiential, almost a spiritual standpoint than I do anything else, because my experience with it is that without it, we're not having this conversation because I'm no longer here. Niacin probably saved my life more times than anything else I can count. And there was a time in 2023 where I was taking 7 to 9 grams of vitamin B3, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of niacinamide, inositol hexaniacinate, which is a form of niacin that's bound to inositol, and about 5 to 6 grams, depending on how much I had available, of pure niacin.
So there's going to be
that there was.
Yeah, there's going to be some people who obviously you might struggle with the flushing aspect. I'm just curious from a general standpoint, right? Not getting into the nuances of a specific person because everybody's going to be a little bit different. But generally, do you sense or experience or have knowledge of that most people will get the same therapeutic benefit of straight up niacin as opposed to niacinamide?
Well, niacinamide and niacin are different chemicals. They're the same nutrient, but they do different things in the body. And as we kind of progress with understanding vitamin B3, we start seeing that there are more differences between niacinamide and niacin than we initially thought. Niacinamide doesn't cause the vasodilation or the alleged histamine dumping that niacin does, but niacinamide has other important effects, especially on lipids, because during the stress response, niacinamide prevents the dumping of fat globules into the vascular system, which has an indirect effect on protecting against atherosclerosis. Whereas niacin does that to a certain degree, but it mostly affects the vasodilation of the capillary beds, which causes the redness when you get the flush, that allows for red blood cells to transport nutrients and waste much more effectively, and also getting cholesterol to the liver to be processed. That's the reason why it affects cholesterol. So niacinamide is not really going to affect your cholesterol levels, but it will, on the periphery, protect against oxidative damage from oxidized fatty acids that are dumped into the blood from the stress response. Niacinamide also seems to have a very significant impact on connective tissue. It was Dr. William Kaufman in the 1940s who used high dose, frequent dose, like 250 to 500 milligrams every waking hour to get people with debilitating arthritis to get up and walk out of their chairs and never have those symptoms again. And it was remarkable when you look at this guy's research that if we were able to duplicate that, we could end arthritis as we know, and you combine it with vitamin C, there's no question. So niacin does not have that same effect. However, the vasodilation that comes from nicotinic acid would, of course, support that because it increases blood flow to the extremities. There's also something that I noticed through a particular patient of mine who I can't name, but where the use of flushing levels of niacin, which is anywhere from 200 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams at any one time during the day, really helped with symptoms of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and any other type of neurological issue that would result in neuropathy. And one of the things that was reported was the nerves that where the numbness was felt, or the neuropathy was felt, or the issues with the twitching became extremely itchy, like the nerves were waking up. So there's something that niacin does that I have not seen in the literature where it can enliven and wake up a dying or dead nervous system.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about what to take, that's why I think when it comes to niacin, it's really important to consult with somebody who has experienced it and who understands the science behind it. Because a general person can take 500 milligrams of niacinamide 3 times a day, and it's cheap. It's going to help them. You combine that with a B complex and with vitamin C, you're going to be good to go. But if we're talking about for a therapeutic effect, we have to use some combination of niacinamide and niacin, or we need to monitor it, because we'll start at a very small amount and then we'll do that consistently until the person no longer has the flush, because the more consistent you take niacin, the less you start experiencing the flush, because the body starts adapting to it and starts utilizing it much more effectively. So we're trying to induce the flush because of various other different reasons that we'll get into at another time. But we start niacin at 50 or 100 milligrams. I start 100 milligrams because that's the only amount that I could get in an affordable form. So we start at 100 milligrams. Time the amount of time it takes to flush. Like if someone takes it at 7 o'clock at night, maybe they'll start flushing by 8, and then we'll keep a record of that. And then over the next couple of days, they might get the flush earlier, they might get it later, but it'll be less and less until it disappears. Then we add another 100 or 200 or 300 milligrams, and we monitor it, and we try to bring it up as high as we can to the point where we feel comfortable with that amount that person can take consistently for a period of time. Some people, I would just give them a timed release or a sustained release. And I don't buy into this nonsense that sustained release or timed release niacin product causes liver problems. I think that's hogwash. I've never seen someone drop dead of me giving them a sustained or a timed release. And that's what I just took before this consultation. And my liver is fine. And there are these concerns. Well, what about, the flush is not dangerous. The flush is something that you want. It's something that is incredibly important for your vascular system, for your detoxification, for your liver, and then also for your nervous system, which is something that we recently discovered. But liver enzymes that get elevated from taking niacin, it's an absolutely meaningless marker, because the reference ranges are created based on people who aren't taking that amount of niacin. So of course it's going to be higher. And just when you see these elevated liver enzymes, it doesn't mean that you have liver disease. It's not giving you cirrhosis of the liver. We can't treat the test report. We have to look at the test reports in context And if somebody's taking physiological doses of niacin, they're going to have elevated liver enzymes because their liver is working more efficiently. And if you look at the actual liver itself of somebody who takes a lot of niacin, it's like the cleanest liver on the planet. And fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease may in fact be the result of niacin deficiency. We may be able to eradicate fatty liver disease completely by using niacin in physiological amounts.
And that right now is a huge, well, not right now, it has been and is developing it's an epidemic
it's monstrous.
level. Yeah. So let me ask you,
it's monstrous.
As we wrap this up, Michael, what is the relationship in just a broad standpoint between vitamin C now and vitamin B3?
This is a great question, and we need to really go down this rabbit hole and think three-dimensionally about this, because remember, tryptophan is converted into vitamin B3, and vitamin B3 is a tryptophan hog. Remember what we said before. We were talking early on about amino acid conversion into these metabolites, how it cannot happen without the presence of vitamin C. Vitamin C plays an active, critical, terminal role in the conversion of tryptophan to vitamin B3, which makes you wonder how many cases over the years of pellagra are really the result of insufficient vitamin C that may actually be a peripheral or parallel condition to scurvy, because pellagra and scurvy always seem to go hand in hand. So There's always been this relationship between the two. So vitamin C helps and is almost like the quarterback of converting tryptophan to vitamin B3. Also, it's involved in converting tryptophan to serotonin and then from serotonin to melatonin. So vitamin C is intimately involved in the conversion pathway of tryptophan. And if you look at all the enzymes that are involved, it is overloaded with enzymes that are controlled by vitamin C and also controlled by magnesium. And here's another interesting aspect of this. Niacin is needed to convert vitamin B6 to its biochemical active form. And then that active form, in turn, circles back and helps convert tryptophan to vitamin B3 and vitamin B3 to NAD and NADPH. So we're talking about what we could call vitamin synergism, where these nutrients act not as vitamins, but as enzyme catalysts. So what is vitamin C? Is vitamin C an ascorbic acid? Of course, it's an organic acid, and it should be considered as such. But it behaves much more like a ubiquitous universal enzyme, more than anything else. And you can look at niacin, nicotinic acid, that it doesn't behave like a vitamin either, that it behaves much more like a neurotransmitter or much more like an amino acid. Niacin might actually be something that shouldn't be considered a vitamin either. And if you look at vitamin C, we can get up to 80 to 90 to 100 grams of vitamin C a day, which could supersede somebody's protein and fat intake. So is vitamin C a micronutrient, or is it a different type of nutrient that's its own special class? So we have to look at these two nutrients in the context of human health in such a way where we're identifying them from their own individual context, that we can't lump them into the category of vitamins. But the relationship between vitamin C and vitamin B3 is significant. And if we talk about mitochondrial function, remember, we need NAD in order to produce energy in the mitochondria, which you talk about all the time in your mitochondrial classes. And niacin, nicotinic acid, converts directly into NAD. But what people forget about is that the mitochondria are oxidation factories. They make massive amounts of energy on a cellular level that produces more oxidative species than anything else we could ever be exposed to. So if there isn't something to quell this oxidation, the mitochondria underperform. They cannot perform in such a way that causes cellular destruction. Otherwise, we die. Vitamin C, when it's present in physiological amounts in the mitochondria, quells this excessive oxidation and allows the mitochondria to fire hotter, to work more efficiently, more effectively, and therefore cells live longer. This is why vitamin C is a critical component of what we call anti-aging. So another time we can go over the chemistry of how vitamin C gets into cells, gets into nuclei, and gets into the mitochondria. But vitamin C and niacin work hand in hand in cellular energy. That doesn't matter how much niacin you have. It doesn't matter how much NAD you have. It doesn't matter what is going on chemically in the mitochondria. If the chemical reaction is destructive to the actual cell itself, it is going to dial back to a level where it won't be destructive anymore. Vitamin C allows the mitochondria to maximize and optimize its energy making capability. So the two you cannot have one without the other, which is why whenever I go and get started with somebody, before even blinking an eye, we're getting started on three things: vitamin C, vitamin B3, and magnesium. We can talk about magnesium another day because I know that you spend a lot of time discussing it.
Yeah.
But those are ultimately the three nutrients that I supplement people with, and we could talk about probiotics. But the conversion factor of niacin is incredibly important, and you do not convert tryptophan to niacin or nicotinic acid to its other forms without the presence of vitamin C. It just simply doesn't happen.
Well, all of these things are incredibly helpful and very interesting, and they're all interrelated. And I know one of the things that Linus Pauling, I'm sure knows probably from an in-depth, or did know from an in-depth standpoint, was the chemistry. And you're absolutely right about vitamin C and the relationship with B3 and mitochondria. I've done quite a bit of writing about that. I do a lot of lecturing about that. So that's great. So Michael, as we finish up, what are some good resources for people out there to learn more about these nutrients? And then more specifically, what are some resources where people can get in contact with you?
Well, you mentioned Tom Levy, and Tom Levy was one of my teachers. I actually had lunch with him and numerous conversations with him about various different things, anywhere from ancient history, alien life, to vitamin C and mold and fungus and candida. But Tom Levy is really the world's expert on vitamin C. And he also studied with Dr. Hubbard, who turned him on to the concept that calcium is not something that we really should be supplementing with. So there's a book that he has called Death by Calcium, which is phenomenal. And I have an autographed copy of it. And in fact, I have all of his books, and he signed all of them for me. I just bought them all one day. It's like, can you sign everything? And he has another book on vitamin C, which is one of the books that you're referring to, called Curing the Incurable. But he has like 6 books on vitamin C, and another book on magnesium. So if you want to get into like a good primer on vitamin C of books that are actually still in print, Tom Levy is really where you want to go, because all the other books are not in print anymore. You can't get anything from Linus Pauling. You can't get Erwin Stone's book. You can't get it's difficult to find the research from Frederick Klenner, but Tom Levy does a wonderful job on this. And then also you can refer back to my website. There's a lot of information on there, druglessfunctionalmedicine.com. And at some point, eventually, I'm going to publish my own little thing on this, probably as an ebook or something, just to get the word out there. As far as niacin is concerned, that's a real challenge. There was a book recently put out before Andrew Saul died. It was actually right before he died. He was able to publish the second edition of Niacin, The Real Story. But that book can get kind of convoluted because there's so much information in there. And there's a whole section on COVID, which is a very difficult read. So if somebody wants to get into that, but it's going to take a couple of times reading it through, and because there's no other real resource out there right now on niacin. You might be able to find a few videos on Rumble or YouTube, but I have an interview that I did went to more extensive detail about niacin, and I printed it on my website, so you can go ahead and check that out on druglessfunctionalmedicine.com. And I'm going to be putting a lot more out there on this. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to niacin, it is the nutrient that seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
And it's next to impossible to get good, updated, accurate information on it. And ever since it was discovered or assumed, there's always been a war from the mainstream and the conventional against it. It seems like it's too simple of a solution to problems that have been pervasive in human society, especially Western society. So if you want a really good resource on niacin, probably my website is the best place to start. And then I'm going to be doing a lot more work on this and getting a lot more word out there after this recording to kind of educate people on niacin. And another thing about niacin is good luck trying to find it. You can't find it anywhere. They're not making it. Niacinamide is becoming impossible. Maybe you'll get enough of it in a B complex to deal with casual deficiency, but from a therapeutic standpoint, it is next to impossible to find. And one thing that's really great about it is that even now, it's the cheapest and least expensive supplement, and might very well be the most important nutrient that we can supplement.
Yeah, and these things are just like vitamin C is, relatively inexpensive depending on the form. So Michael, it's been a great conversation. So the website is druglessfunctionalmedicine.com. I've got it up right now on my computer. There's a ton of information. I see the niacin interviews, so make sure everybody goes there. So thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, it was wonderful. Great questions. Love the conversation. Thanks for everything, Kurt.
All right. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast with Dr. Kurt Woeller. For more information about this podcast, go to functionalmedicinedoctalk.com.